Hello, this is Julian Dale, back at it again with another roller coaster video. For much of my life, my passion for roller coasters has distinguished me from most of the people I know, including family, friends, and girlfriends. Sometimes I took pride in this, while other times I was embarrassed. I didn't want to be seen as some geek who brings up coasters whenever the conversation allows it. But no matter how I feel about this obsession of mine, I can't deny that roller coasters are intrinsic to my life story. Sure, music plays arguably a bigger role in my life today, but roller coasters are a much bigger commonality between my childhood and adulthood. That's basically what I'm here to discuss, the long story of how roller coasters shaped who I am. This video has been a bright idea for about a year now, but I guess I was preoccupied with other projects, coaster-related or otherwise. That's not to mention my more personal struggles. So, my life as a New Jersey coaster enthusiast essentially began when I first saw a roller coaster. In the summer of 1998, my parents took me and my brother George to Jenkinson's Boardwalk. It was a typical family day trip, 2 kids sitting impatiently in the car until they got to the park, where they would be impatient some more. Yeah, no kid likes waiting in line. Anyway, I had a good time on all those kiddie rides, but I noticed how George was allowed on a few other rides since he was bigger than me. One of these was called a roller coaster, and that day, George was the one who introduced me to that term. The roller coaster in question was the Flitzer, a fairly common model from Zero. In recent years, this version was moved down to Ocean City, Maryland, but fortunately I did ride it before then, because it really is an important coaster to me. However, it was not the first one I rode. 2 years passed until I finally had the guts. In the summer before kindergarten, I went on a family vacation to Toronto, and one of our stops was the small town of Owego, New York. We were lucky enough to be there during the county fair, where we enjoyed the demolition derby and, more importantly, the rides. One of these was a tiny coaster with a simple oval layout, probably designed by Wisdom Rides. That's George and I in the front seat, and at the time, I was probably having the most thrilling experience of my life. If only I could track down that thing. After all, this was just a traveling coaster, so I do not consider it my first credit. For that, we have to jump ahead about 1 year. In 2001, probably between our morning cartoons, George and I first saw a commercial for Six Flags Great Adventure, which probably caught our eye due to all the Looney Tunes characters. After plenty of begging, our parents took us to the park that spring or summer, and since this was my first big-time amusement park, I was amazed by what I saw. I had never seen coasters this big, and the size of that place made it feel like I was stepping into a different world. I remember being intimidated by the roar coming from Batman the Ride. However, with the exception of the Ferris wheel, I was still sticking to the kiddie rides. Among them were Blackbeard's Lost Treasure Train and Roadrunner Railway, which now go by different names. I don't know which one I rode first, so either one could be my first credit, although it's possible that I skipped both. Meanwhile, George was clearly more daring than me, getting on all sorts of flipping rides and intense roller coasters. Nitro immediately became his favorite, although my dad did not share his enthusiasm. He preferred Runaway Mine Train, which is still his favorite to this day. For my family's next big vacation, there were 2 destinations, Block Island and Jackson, New Hampshire, where my aunt and uncle lived. They knew their nephews were going through an amusement park phase, so we all took a little trip to Storyland, which was only a few miles away. This is where George and I rode the Polar Coaster, my first out-of-state credit, and possibly first overall. We all loved it, and this is what I like to think is my aunt's favorite coaster. To this day, she simply won't ride anything more thrilling. That summer, we also spent a couple nights in Seaside Heights, where we had some fun at Casino Pier. Once again, I mostly stuck to kiddie rides, but I remember being enthralled by the enormous skyscraper ride. The timing of this visit meant that George may have experienced the old Wizard's Cavern coaster, but I don't know for sure, although he definitely rode the Mylar Wild Mouse. I'm happy the latter is gone, but not so much the former. At this point, George and I grew ever more fascinated by the amusement parks of the world. Our internet back then may have been dreadfully slow, but it allowed us to view images of modern thrill rides we'd never seen before. Plus, the children's section of our local library had some great books to check out, like these two, for instance. We were mostly interested in the pictures, so we didn't quite learn enough to become full-fledged enthusiasts. Still, our imaginations were running wild, and we were eager to grow up so we could open our own amusement park. In preparation for that day, we made a Word document listing all the different rides we wanted, although George honestly did most of the work. This fantasy park included several rides that already existed, but also some bizarre made-up ones, such as Pug's Paw, Towel Hang, and Blowing Dust. Along with all the parks we had visited that summer, this arguably made 2001 the most important year in my history as a coaster enthusiast. But in October, there was a tragic development that played the biggest role of all. At the age of 9, George died in an accident, leaving me as the only potential coaster enthusiast in the household. In the next few years, I played with his toys and often wore his clothes, but that pales in comparison to the amusement park obsession I inherited. For one thing, the fantasy park lived on with me. I often listed the rides I wanted, just like George did, and sometimes I even drew pictures to get a sense of where everything would be placed. As for real life, I started to do some research. The book that kick-started this process was Roller Coasters by Mike Schaefer and Scott Rutherford. In addition to the pictures I always enjoyed, it detailed many coasters all across America, like the Beast, Magnum XL 200, Kumba, Steel Phantom, now known as Phantom's Revenge, and the Coney Island Cyclone. I was also introduced to several manufacturers, designers, and coaster elements. Later, I also owned the American Roller Coaster and Roller Coasters, a thrill seeker's guide to the ultimate scream machines. These introduced me to a lot of defunct and more modern coasters the other book did not include, plus the nuts and bolts of roller coaster technology. In my grade school years, all of this information was the perfect distraction from the grief we were all experiencing. My first amusement park after George died was Canobie's. My mom took me there with my best friend at the time, who just happened to be named George, and we had the full experience where you also spend a couple nights at the campground and enjoy the pool. As for the park, we mainly focused on the flat rides, my favorite being the downdraft. While we were amazed by the dense structure of the park's wooden coasters, my only credit on that trip was the now-defunct high-speed thrill coaster, which was a great time, as you can tell by the picture. Overall, Canobie's is one of my top 5 parks to this day, and in the years ahead, I was able to return 4 more times. In 2004, I made Twister and Phoenix my first wooden coasters, the latter being my introduction to Airtime. Plus, I was able to snag another rare credit in Whirlwind, which was actually in its final season. Jumping ahead to 2017, I also experienced the park's newer coasters, being lucky enough to catch the flying turns on a good day. Finally, there was one visit later that year where I brought my ex with me, who unfortunately was not crazy about roller coasters. To make matters worse, this was a botched attempt to get back together with her, and I was pretty upset about it for the rest of the summer. Hopefully I'll have a far better experience when I go back. I'll make it a point to bring a girl who loves both me and the coasters. Going back to my earlier days, 2003 was pretty uneventful, aside from a visit to Great Adventure with my dad. There were no credits that day, although I did get a good look at the new flying coaster. Anyway, 2004 proved to be more interesting. Aside from the aforementioned Canobie's trip, my parents took me to the shore twice, each time with a friend from school. Most notably, I got to experience the now-defunct Funtown Pier, which unfortunately met its demise after Hurricane Sandy. The highlight of the visit was the looping coaster, one of only 2 interpark creations to operate in America. This was the first inverting coaster I ever experienced, and it took some encouragement from my friend to conquer my fears. But once I did, I felt like a badass and kept getting back in line. Sure, this was a janky little coaster, but it still broke my heart to see it bite the dust. When it came to my coaster obsession, grandparents played a very minor role, with the exception of my grandpa, Chum. For one thing, I'm pretty sure he bought me one of my old Connect sets. Since he only lived an hour and a half away, he had many chances to bond with his grandkids. One of our favorite spots was the Palisades Center Mall, where you could see fake coaster track hanging from the ceiling. Long ago, you could visit Jeepers, a small jungle-themed FEC with a real coaster. Python Pit was a miler kiddie coaster with a cool train, tunnel, and view of the mall below. It was a favorite of mine in the early days, and since I'm not sure when I took my first ride, it's another contender for my first credit. But in 2004, it was no longer enough. Aware of my recent trip to Knoebels, Chum took me to Rye Playland, where I was excited to try the Dragon Coaster. Unfortunately, I was expecting Phoenix, and I did not get it. To this day, I find the historical merits far outweigh the thrills. In recent years, I would return to Playland twice, most notably last summer for an ACE event. When I found out I could ride the kiddie coaster, I was itching to go, since adults usually cannot ride it. As the coaster season was winding down back in 2004, something came along that changed everything. My mom showed me a newspaper article announcing the tallest and fastest coaster in the world, and where would it be? Six Flags Great Adventure, less than 1 hour away. I was so proud of my home park for snatching away the record from Cedar Point, and spring of 2005 could not come soon enough. Meanwhile, I was mentioning King Dakar all the time at school. I even remember writing a contract for my friends where they swore to ride with me. On top of this, it was eventually my turn to be an anchor on my school news program, so I decided to talk about King Dakar. I'm sure none of the other fourth graders were surprised, but what mattered was that the whole school was watching, and surely this was the first time many younger kids even heard about the coaster. After months of following King Dakar's progress online, I could not wait any longer to see the coaster in person, so my dad took me to the park early that season on a cold day in March. This proved to be a memorable visit, not just because of the new coaster, but because of all the other ones. Starting with Superman Ultimate Flight, I rode every major coaster, and there were so many firsts. First flying coaster, first hyper coaster, first invert, first rough coaster, and first launch coaster in Batman and Robin the Chiller. And all the while, my dad rode by my side with his eyes closed. All these firsts were thanks to the short lines that day. In retrospect, I believe this is the day I truly became a coaster enthusiast, and from here on out, there was nothing I wouldn't ride. It was such a special day that my dad even bought season passes for both of us, since he knew I'd be going back that year. The season pass would be renewed the following year, but surprisingly, that would be the last time I was a pass holder for any park chain. Interestingly enough, my next trip to Great Adventure would be the exact opposite of the last. I went with my mom on a warm day when lines were long and King Dakar was open. Actually, it was having technical issues most of the time, and we didn't see it running until we were on the Ferris wheel. We hustled over to the Golden Kingdom area, where we found one of the longest lines I've ever seen for a coaster. It was something like an hour and a half, although I know there are longer lines out there. In all that time, I saw some truly frightened riders waiting to be launched, and I grew more excited by the minute. Finally, it was our turn for the ultimate adrenaline rush. It was so memorable that we ended up buying our first on-ride photo. I think everybody's reactions sum up the whole thing. Also, this was really the beginning of having my mom as my coaster buddy, which continued for a good 10 years or so. She was more daring than my dad, and her reactions were far more entertaining. Fortunately, 2005 was not all about Great Adventure. For starters, my mom and I saw some friends in Myrtle Beach, where we checked out the now-defunct Myrtle Beach Pavilion. Not a bad park for what it was, but the only thing that stood out was the short-lived Hurricane, a woody with quite a bite. RMC would have had a ball with it. Later that summer, I also spent a few nights in Williamsburg, Virginia, where my parents could appreciate the history while I could appreciate the thrills. Everyone was happy. Busch Gardens was a park I'd known about for a few years, so this is another visit I'll never forget, even though we only had half the coasters you can ride today. Fortunately, one of these was Big Bad Wolf, the world's most famous suspended coaster. Another first for me. As legendary as it is now, it was probably my least favorite coaster of the day, since I preferred the Airtime on Apollo's Chariot and the barrage of inversions on Alpengeist. The cherry on top for this trip was an additional credit on the way home. In Delaware, we passed by Blue Diamond Park, and I somehow persuaded my parents to stop there. The park had a Pinfari Zyklon, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but this was special for 3 reasons. It was my first time riding this model, it's my only Delaware credit to this day, and most importantly, this is the coaster that would eventually injure 6 people in Florida. For me, the last few months of 2005 were pretty eventful. Pretty much all year, I was crazy about King Ka, so you can imagine my excitement when Great Adventure announced yet another coaster. I could not have imagined a better follow-up if I tried. El Toro would crush the record for steepest wooden coaster, and the concept art for that drop was giving me goosebumps. It would not break the height or speed records, but that didn't matter. For those in the Northeast, odds are this would be the most massive pile of wood you could ever hope to ride. Even in 2023, none of my wooden coaster credits can match the stats of El Toro. Back then, New Jersey really had everyone's attention in the coaster world. Staring at pictures just wasn't enough anymore, so it was at this point that I had to find some enthusiasts. My mom was a good companion, but she would never ride this stuff on her own time. As a 5th grader without any real-world connections, it looked like my only hope was on the internet. Somehow, I came across Theme Park Critic, a site where pretty much anyone could rate and share their thoughts about the rides they've been on. Plus, there were forums set aside for more in-depth discussion. In the days when my parents didn't quite trust the internet, joining this site was a major breakthrough for me. As embarrassing as they are today, all those reviews I posted were my first real presence on the internet. You could even argue it was my first social media experience, predating my old MySpace account by 1.5 years. By the way, you know Theme Park Critic is old when the only RMC you can review is New Texas Giant. They don't even call it that. It just says Texas Giant Reprofile. Back to riding coasters. My parents decided to take us to Las Vegas for the holidays, and my one Christmas present was access to all the coasters the Strip had to offer. First of all, there was Speed the Ride, my most prized credit. I was instantly addicted to that coaster, and the only thing that kept me from riding all day was lunchtime. Then there was Adventure Dome, where I rode Canyon Blaster, a surprisingly intense aero looper. That whole place was just mesmerizing with all its rockwork and attractions so clustered together. Of course, I also had the bright idea of trying the Manhattan Express, a miserable experience with slow operations and a rough, awkward layout. Finally, there was a massive yellow coaster just 45 minutes away, way out in the desert. Desperado could be seen from many miles away, and I kept getting more excited for the beast that awaited me. In the end, it really was a beast, because it beat the shit out of me. That second turn is like a prolonged car accident. However, the powerful camelbacks really made up for that, causing me to overrate this coaster for years. Of course, all of this was just a prelude for what 2006 had to offer. Once again, Great Adventure posted lots of construction photos, and we knew they were serious once the first drop appeared. I spread the word as best I could, even though I couldn't broadcast it this time. After the Bull was released in June, our experience was pretty similar to the year before, except for that weird fart noise coming from the coaster. Eventually, we took our seats, and I could not believe how far the lap bars came down, although I would soon be grateful. To this day, El Toro's drop is the most powerful I've experienced, and the camelbacks really keep up the momentum. However, the real surprise that day was the now famous Rolling Thunder Hill, although the interaction with the neighboring coaster is just a memory. In the end, my mind was blown once again, and this new coaster taught me the importance of a good layout. King Ka may have the stats on its side, but it doesn't use them enough to crack my top 25. Not now, at least. The fun didn't end there. Later that summer, I finally got to visit the legendary Cedar Point. The park is such a big deal that my parents were willing to drive all the way out there without checking out anything else. We rented a cabin over by Mean Streak, where I would watch several Full House episodes, and we took a nice long walk on the beach to make up for the car ride. And then, of course, there were the coasters. We had to spread them out over the course of 2 days because it was too exhausting for my parents. Now, where do I begin? I rode everything but the smallest coasters, which was a total of 14 credits, my favorite being Magnum XL 200. I felt unique since everyone else seemed to prefer Millennium Force. For me, it was just a question of airtime. Magnum is an important coaster to me since it was my favorite for longer than any other, and currently it's still in my top 10. Overall, this was an amazing trip I probably didn't deserve due to my lousy performance in 5th grade. And that was it for 2006. While there were fewer coasters the following year, this phase of my coaster obsession was still going strong, since I continued to post on Theme Park Critic. Some of my last reviews were after my first trip to Dorney Park in October 2007. It may be an inferior Cedar Fair park, but I was long overdue for a visit. My parents didn't give me time for everything, but I enjoyed Steel Force, even though it doesn't deserve the same colors as Magnum. However, the highlight of the visit ended up being Laser, a Schwarzkopf looper that was sadly removed the following year. Aside from it being a rare credit, it was also my first gray out on a roller coaster. Those back-to-back loops were no joke. Now, if you thought 2007 was weak, it only got worse the following year. As I entered adolescence, I became increasingly self-conscious, not wanting to be seen as some loser who won't talk about anything but coasters. When relatives brought it up, I would try to change the subject. Truly, I was forgetting how I came to like coasters in the first place. Music was slowly displacing them in my mind, especially heavy metal, and when I saw a Metallica documentary, I was determined to become a bassist. Sadly, the only 2008 credit I recall was a Mylar Wildmouse at Funtown Pier. This model was never that common, so I guess I was wise to give it a shot when the opportunity arose. The next year was a little better, since my parents signed me up for our local travel camp, and there were a few amusement parks on the agenda. This is how I was finally able to visit Wildwood, since my parents were never willing to drive that far for the shore. Unfortunately, I'm pretty sure we were only allowed on the Central Pier. Well, at least that meant I could ride Sea Serpent, my first ever Vekoma boomerang. 8 boomerangs later, this one is still my favorite. After I got my driver's license, I happily returned to Wildwood multiple times, allowing me to experience all the other coasters, both good and bad. An even better year was 2010, thanks to a quirky summer camp in Pennsylvania called Stone Mountain Adventures. It's best known for activities like wakeboarding and horseback riding, but they would actually take you to Hershey Park if you stayed for 2 consecutive sessions. Currently my favorite amusement park, I originally experienced it with the buddy system, and my buddies just happened to share my bravery. We wandered around and tried a decent variety of coasters, but would you believe that I walked away thinking Wildcat was the best one? That's how you know I was not an enthusiast back then. Still, I'm very grateful for the generosity on the part of Stone Mountain. In more recent years, I would return to Hershey to pick up the remaining credits, like Comet and Great Bear, plus newer ones like the incredible Sky Rush. For summer 2011, a different camp took me to an amusement park. This was Apple Farm, an arts center that was known for its music festival, but I was only affiliated with their arts camp. Kids and teens from all over flocked to Elmer, New Jersey to learn about stuff like music, dance, and video production, whatever they preferred. As if the activities weren't enough, my girlfriend was on campus this particular summer, who we'll just call Girl Number 1. Similar to Stone Mountain, the amusement park was in between sessions, and this time we visited Great Adventure. It was the first time I ever rode coasters with a girl, and it took some persuasion to make her ride everything. I even remember her praying a little bit before we left the station on El Toro. Can't say I blame her. While we did go back to Great Adventure 2 years later, this was unfortunately the only park we ever visited together. But for me, the real star of 2011 was more surprising. After camp, my dad and I flew out west for a college visit in Montana, except we could only land in Utah. You know what that means, lagoon. Even though I didn't love coasters the way I used to, I knew this was a rare opportunity. For the first time, I was able to explore a park alone and unhindered by a buddy system. I guess my dad was too tired from all the traveling. Anyway, I found Lagoon to be a very charming park with a nice variety of rides. This was back when Wicked was the standout coaster. Today, it's certainly the only one I remember well enough to rank. Hell, I don't even know if I rode Jetstar 2 due to the single rider policy. That's the reason I'm hoping to return with a girl. Moving on to 2012, I went on yet another trip to Great Adventure, this time with my high school pre-calc class. It was quite unremarkable, except for our ride on El Toro. Right after cresting the Rolling Thunder hill, I saw a phone go flying. Naturally, my hands were already in the air, so I made a very quick grab and rescued it. On the brake run, I held it up and got a nice little applause, and the guy in front of us breathed a sigh of relief. Now, I have a hard time believing in miracles, but the odds were clearly against that guy. Nowadays, it makes sense why the park wants you to use a locker, at least for this coaster. But 2012 was notable for a completely different reason. My mom's side of the family is from Finland, and that summer she thought it was time for me to go out there, so I studied the language a bit. Trust me, it's not an easy one to speak. Good thing most of them know English over there. Anyway, the two of us spent about 2 weeks touring the country, using nothing but public transport. I met several relatives for the first time, but they usually acted like they'd seen me before. But what about coasters? Well, naturally, the first stop on our journey was Helsinki, where you could visit Linnanmäki. It was just one part of a long day exploring the city, but for me, it was the highlight. I like how it's a free admission park, and that big water tower is an interesting centerpiece. Perhaps the excitement of being in a different country fogged up my memory, but I only recall 3 coasters, although each one was interesting. My favorite was Ukko, a Maurer sky loop that provides quite a rare experience if you're American. Back home, the only one like it is hiding down in Arkansas. Then there was Vuoristorata, my first side friction coaster, and first one with a brakeman. In Europe, there are a few others like it, and I've heard it pales in comparison to the one at Tivoli Gardens. Still, I was very satisfied with this coaster, especially on those double dips. Finally, we have Kirnu, the first Intamin Zaxspin, similar to Green Lantern First Flight back in America, although this smaller version was never built back home. I actually had no complaints, and that final flip is really a doozy. It definitely freaked out my mom, causing her to nickname this coaster the Evil Clown. After some time with our relatives to the east, Tampere was the next big city we visited, and perhaps the most beautiful. So what better place to have Finland's tallest observation tower? And why not build an amusement park around it? This is Sarkaniemi, which has a nice little rivalry with Linnanmäki. It sure is equally charming. I was happy to stumble upon the Angry Birds area, which is based on a Finnish game that was quite addictive in my high school days. But obviously, I was more focused on the coasters. I'm glad I could ride Tornado, one of the only Intamin inverts, but somehow it wasn't memorable enough for me to rank. Perhaps Jetstar and Halfpipe were more notable since they're defunct, and I think defunct overseas credits are pretty valuable. Not to mention, we only have one Jetstar left in America. So, as a coaster enthusiast, 2012 clearly holds a special place in my heart. It wasn't all about finding the most intense coaster. These were simply the days when amusement parks complemented everything else I was doing. As far as that era is concerned, it didn't get any better than the Finnish parks. But now the question is, what would be the follow-up? High school was almost over, and with the coming of a new era, perhaps coasters would start playing a different role in my life. Well, let's skip ahead to October of that year. New Jersey was in the midst of Hurricane Sandy, the largest storm I've ever experienced, and my school would be closed for at least a week. After the storm cleared up, I discovered a surreal picture that showed a roller coaster drowning in the Atlantic. Right away, I recognized it as the Starjet, the largest coaster in that part of the state. I've been on coasters that met the scrapyard, but this was something different. It was as if Starjet met the scrapyard instantaneously, where everyone could see it. It was never a favorite of mine, but such an unceremonious loss was almost heartbreaking. I say almost because I was simply not an enthusiast back then. I had other things on my mind. Little did I know that the famous picture of the dead coaster would be symbolic of where my coaster obsession was going. The coaster was out of commission, but could it ever be replaced?